Hello and welcome. I'm excited to be part of BBELT 2025 and to share a teaching approach that transforms language learning, integrating real world challenges and the UN Sustainable Development Goals into English instruction. As English teachers, uh, we often hear students ask, why are we learning this? Or how does this apply to the real world? Today, I'll show you how we can answer these questions by making English a tool for solving real world problems. We will explore a four-steps framework to integrate the SDGs into English classroom. Today, we will be looking at how we can implement using real-world texts, also structuring research tasks, designing creative solutions, and ensuring accessibility, because that is sometimes what causes us a lot of trouble when we think of ways in which we can put real material into the classroom. The question would be, where do we begin? Most of the hardest questions we have when we are planning an activity or a session has to do directly with how we explore information and how we explore texts and materials. However, if we have a very clear organization, if we think of all the necessities that our students have when we are in the classroom, it's not that difficult to actually visualize and see what is needed. If we follow some steps that have been the guide to me when we are working with these materials, it's going to be way much easier. When we look at it, for instance, we can see steps such as exploring texts, conducting research, guide students to investigate issues, for instance, or designing solutions, and finally presenting findings. We always think that that could be a little bit of a problem. However, something relevant that we need to focus our attention on has to do directly on how we organize everything. The very first thing that I would like to ask you is if you are familiar with the SDGs and what the UN has to offer to us for our English classroom. The very first thing is how we do this approach, because we can have the traditional approach in which students read about like climate change, for instance, or migration or any other subject. However, it is important that we identify that we have alternative ways in which we can present the topics. The very first thing we have to identify is that all these SDGs can have an SDG-powered approach. What does it mean? Well, the very first thing that we have to identify has to do directly with having students identify aspects that can impact directly their community, so then it can be meaningful. So that is the moment in which we can identify certain materials that are not so difficult to picture. The very first thing is that selecting a text shouldn't be a problem. However, we face the music when we want to get some certain materials that we don't feel very comfortable. As English teachers at the Language Center or at the school, we realize that we have texts available at hand. However, it is very important that we have access to all these different sections. And an example of those are this that I'm displaying right now on screen, which has to do with problems that are directly linked to the SDGs. The SDGs, and I will just talk to you a little bit about them in the next minutes. However, whenever we look at this kind of problems, it's kind of easy to identify that all these topics are very relevant to their reality because it's what they face on a daily basis, such as climate change or food supply, even if we think of them as something kind of difficult to track. However, whenever we look at the texts, they are not so difficult to understand because especially those materials can be already designed for students to learn. The very first thing is to identify that they need to be allocated to real world relevance. Also, that they should be accessible and yet challenging, because if a material is not challenging enough, students will just consider that not to be so difficult to understand, so then they would disengage quickly. On the other hand, whenever we think of the multiple perspectives that the text offers, like this, it can also be a positive thing, considering that it exposes students to different viewpoints on an issue. Having said that, something that we can do now is to connect it to the real world problems. An example of them include the 2030 agenda that includes the Sustainable Development Goals. All of them, as a whole, can imply different problems and different realities, different students face on different contexts. For instance, we have the migration example, in which students read on global migration, identify connections to SDGs. And here we have two possible. For instance, reduce inequalities, that it's allocated to SDG 10, or SDG 16, which is related to peace and justice. All of them imply and ask students to research a little bit on the topic. It is relevant for us then to trigger the necessary questions and provide conceptual questions that can make them wonder and make them engaged in the topic. This is exactly when we connect it to something that we are not so familiar when we are designing a lesson. That has to do directly with the universal design for learning. The universal design for learning, it's that particular set of tools that allow us to see what else we can do inside the classroom. We always struggle with having students not really connected to the activities because we think that we would need to motivate them. And actually, part of our job as a teacher is to try to keep them engaged. However, the universal design for learning tools allow us to have a very specific focus. The very first thing has to do with motivation. I will start with that one because I guess it's kind of the hardest section that we can develop in students. However, once they find something meaningful, it's not going to be that hard to link. On the other hand, we have representation and action and expression. And at this point, we may be wondering what these two may be about. However, representation and expression has to do with the different and multiple ways in which they can have access to information. Like talking about representation, that they can find texts, that they can have videos, that they can have materials that imply that they are not just expecting the teacher to be giving material. On the other hand, we also have different or multiple ways of expression, which is allowing them to show what they are learning. And that is kind of the hardest part because as a teacher, we feel that it's necessary that they get into a box in which they show us exactly what we are expecting. However, whenever we give them freedom to choose different and multiple ways of expression, they can have posters and videos and reports and models, and that's what makes learning enriching. An example of it would be, for instance, audio versions, like provide recordings for auditory learners. And then in that case, it automatically creates this sense of achievement because students that are more auditory can feel related and then they can feel engaged in the activity. On the other hand, we have visual summaries like infographics or images or diagrams, or like also having students having students some materials in which they can use. So, for instance, now with these technological advances, having tools such as ChatGPT or any kind of translator that works as a bilingual support, or digital tools that enable them to feel more comfortable when expressing or accessing information. All of this, like as a whole, will imply that our students will feel more confident. And us as teachers, we don't feel like we need to be attending every single student's need Instead, what we are doing is supporting the process. And here, like one of the first things we need to consider has to do with asking the right questions, because this is also part of the inquiry-based learning. All of this inquiry-based learning has to do directly with why the issue is happening, who's getting affected, how would I interfere to solve it, what kind of proposals can I have at hand. Now, this is exactly what makes meaningful learning. When we encourage inquiry, what we are doing basically is asking students to involved in the process. Of course, it's not going to be that easy for everyone. And that's why all the activities we design should be allocated to the level they belong to. However, this doesn't mean that we have to provide only easy exercises and simple activities. On the other hand, what we have to identify as necessary is identifying those elements and those challenges that can help students get this sense of achievement. Whenever we are asking the right questions, of course, we would need to face different elements or aspects, such as the challenge that they would need to be facing. Like, what are the biggest challenges whenever we are planning? How do I make sure that the challenge that I'm giving my student will actually get them engaged? Of course, some policies, and then that implies that students are researching. So what are some of the policies that they need to be looking at? What part of this is actually part of their daily lives? How can we make sure that students are engaged not only because they have a task to perform, on the other hand, but because they are really into it? Then it's time to get to the solutions. Of course, at this point, this does not necessarily have to be something applicable in real life. This would be something that students can start thinking of a possible solution that works out for them. And of course, if at some point in the future they manage to make it happen, that would be the best possible scenario. However, what we are doing here is promoting and giving students an excuse to learn. All of this is setting the tune for what we want them to achieve. As you can see there, for instance, an activity that one of the teams that I had in a group developed. For them was easier to identify all these different questions and different concepts, because that's how their learning works. That's how the process went for them. Now, in here, of course, we have to consider that to get to all of this, we need to favor brainstorming solutions. At this point, students need to feel free to have proposals and to set it on the table with their teams, as well as presenting it and socializing it with their classroom. So in such a way that students feel entitled to speak up. One of the biggest challenges that we as English teachers face is that they are not very confident when speaking because of maybe lack of practice during the week, or because they don't feel very confident with their level, or because it is simply something they have blocked in their academic life. However, this can also ensure that students are performing well, and that they can also explore alternatives and they can get to know themselves better. Of course, as they are explaining something relevant, and that you can see also in the students' faces in the photos, is that they have this sense of achievement because they know that their solution works. They know how it works. They know who this benefits. They know why they are doing it, and they know why it is better to do it that way. The best thing we can do is then entitle students and let them explore ways in which this can work out, having models inside their explanations, but also at the same time setting the tune and asking them to comply with the very necessary elements they need when they are presenting. Also, of course, it's important that they know the process. And you as teachers, you need to know the process and how to get from zero to the very last stage. From my experience, I can share with you that there are 5 steps that we can consider. The very first has to do with, of course, reading. As we said, selecting the text, motivating students to engage in the text and in the topic, but also asking them to research, because that's going to be the way in which they will feel it relatable. On the other hand, we can also offer some kind of ideas of solutions so then they can decide on what other solutions they can provide. This will enable them to get this confidence whenever they need to explain. And it's not only explaining something randomly, it has to do with the certain structure that you provide and the kind of guide that they have from you as a teacher. On the other hand, then comes for the presentation and finally the reflect. But let's talk about what the presentation implies. Uh, Talking about the presentation, they can go, as you notice in there, in a gallery walk, or they can have like maybe in here, for instance, 2 stars, like 2 positive comments as they are performing. And so this is also part of the feedback. Having presentations in the classroom shouldn't mean that we have passive students sitting there just expecting the class to be over. On the other hand, what we would expect is that students are engaged not only in their own presentation, but in their partner's presentation. How can we guarantee that? Because we can have these gallery walks, or simply what we may call it as showroom presentations, which may imply simultaneous presentations given at the same time, having all teams involved in different stations. And within these stations, we can ask students to provide comments, of course, positive comments, and at the end, provide a feedback. Now, this feedback can be through different tools that we can use online. In this case, for instance, it was a Google Forms in which they would provide feedback to the team, not to a particular speaker, but to the whole team regarding the content, regarding what they learned, and then what they can actually take from that specific talk. That is going to be way much more effective than just having students listening to the others just for a long period of time. Of course, as you finish all these presentations and these gallery walks, the most relevant aspect would be the post-activity debriefing. What does it mean? It means that students need to show how text on global challenges were used to build reading and critical thinking skills. Can you guarantee that? By asking students to develop an explanation of what they learned and what they developed and what they prepared. Also, on how research tasks are designed so students engage deeply. And that would be a debriefing that you can have with students in the classroom, as well as some questioning that you can have for yourself. Also, on how creative solutions to these problems were designed for project-based learning. And consider that it is important that for all of these different projects, these PBLs that we have in the classroom, students need to have this debriefing and reflection, because that is going to guarantee that they are actually taking something for their everyday learning. Of course, we need to identify that inclusivity should be something that we have to be looking at constantly. That is also part of what the Universal Design for Learning offers, because it does not mean that I have to design an activity for every single student. That implies that we are giving students a wide range of possibilities to show that what they learned, or also to access to information. That, of course, automatically will trigger something in their brains to stay engaged and to stay motivated. Of course, it's important, like how authentically students were assessed using alternative strategies, because besides having a number, besides having the grade, most of the students that we have in a language center may feel that need to know how they are doing. And also, they need to know how the others are doing, because it works as an example for them. Of course, all of this imply that we need to assess presentations effectively from a rubric-based feedback or self-reflection journals or peer reviews. All of this will entitle students to feel comfortable and confident. This can be done in teams, this can be done in stations, or simply it can go through a survey as you observed in the Google Forms previously mentioned. It is important then that we identify why this approach is effective. And the very first thing is critical thinking. We have seen in our books, and it's kind of the trend now, that we have critical thinking development, but we always think of critical thinking as just sharpening their minds to ask questions or sharpening their minds to identify crucial information. On the other hand, it's basically teaching students to think critically based on elements they see in presentations. It's not that I just want them to show comprehension, of course, comprehension. But what else can they take? How can they improve something they observed? What's their insight regarding the issue? Of course, right here, it has to do directly with collaboration. How much did my students collaborate when they were working in the team? Was it effective? What didn't go well? The very first time, I have to admit, it was quite frustrating because students were not engaged, because one of the things that I failed doing was having them collaborating within the teams. Of course, it took me a while to identify the different activities they could do, so then in that way we can guarantee that they are collaborating correctly. And this can be easily solved with clear instructions and a clear checklist or rubric. On the other hand, also we have problem solve. And then this teaches students to problem solve creatively. So it's not that I want you to look at a source on the internet and just bring me again the same results that is already mentioned there. What we want instead is to have them create fantastic proposals. This, of course, would not necessarily fit our real world, but that does not really matter that much, because what we want is to have this, to have this as an excuse. Whenever we are thinking of all of these engaging activities, of course, what we want is to have them motivated along the process, that they feel that they are not just simply left out, that they are there, that you are there with them, and that the process for them goes smoothly. What happens and how do we get this into our classroom? Well, like the very first thing that I have to share with you is to start small. Of course, when we think of the SDGs, it feels like there's a lot of information. And if you are not familiar with them, you can Google it and just identify certain elements from the SDGs. Of course, it would imply that we need to study it beforehand. Yes, definitely. That implies that students need their teacher to be well prepared for questions they may have. However, once you discover the benefits of having SDGs in the classroom as part of the conversation, you can easily connect it to any of the, for instance, National Geographic books, because they are tightly connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, at the same time, we can have students' choice. It's part of the Universal Design for Learning. Universal Design for Learning aims that students feel that freedom to choose. They can find different sources that they can consult, as I mentioned before. But like also something relevant that has to do, it's like the freedom they feel to experiment. Whenever students feel that they are not just simply tied to something that they need to comply, it's when learning actually happens, because we are leaving the door open to explore other possibilities. And the questions may arise saying something like, teacher, so then can I make a diagram? can I explain this in this way? I found this video. What do you think about it? And then the conversations and constant interactions in the classroom will, of course, raise the bar for everyone. As some of them may see a team outperforming, they would feel entitled to do so. Of course, we have these leverage tools. Of course, we can use platforms that enable them to feel confident. And of course, this imply from having expression tools online, like for instance, having Padlet discussions. So it does not necessarily need to be only a verbal interaction in the classroom. This can also be connected directly to interacting online. What if one of the activities during the week can be setting a question or a set of questions in Padlet? And then they need to be responding each other and not just answering the question. So what do you think about your partner's response? How can you, what kind of suggestions would you give your partner to enhance, like his or her knowledge? At the same time, maybe there's something that that student know more than the others, and then that can contribute to the learning process in the classroom. This definitely will bring some very beneficial response. On this, at this point, we of course need to have very clear sources for implementation. These sources, of course, can be allocated to UNESCO materials, National Geographic resources, SDG coming from the United Nations. Now, nonetheless, also PBL guides play an important role within the activity or the project, because this will help you plan better. Of course, the question may be, and then how do I get all these PBL guides? Are there templates? Well, yeah, there are templates everywhere. It's as simple as like checking online or asking ChatGPT to get some ideas that can actually be helpful for you to guide your project. However, the best is your creativity, because based on your experience, based on what you observe in other classes, based on what you read on everyday basis, you can have more tools to show. Of course, assessment in rubrics, it's one of the best tools you can have. Of course, as a teacher, I know how difficult it can be to develop rubrics and understanding how we can actually have this. However, I can tell you based on experience that once we discover that rubrics are not our enemy, on the other hand, they are friends, we can see the benefits of having them. Because, of course, to create them can take us a while. But something relevant about rubrics is that they work as guides for students. And then we won't have students wondering what they should do next. They already have some kind of guide and tool, so then they feel more entitled and confident. They know what's next. They know what step they should be in. And of course, some of the most important part, they can feel motivated. Of course, sometimes they feel pressured and they feel a little bit under stress because of whatever like they need to comply with. However, it is our work as a teacher to be tracking and monitoring, and of course, helping them build possible solutions. Something that I would like to show you is some examples from what I've been developing with them. Of course, it has moved from having students in very advanced levels talking about migration, having discussions inside the classroom, such as debates that are quite related to the United Nations, but also having students reading texts like the ones I showed you at the beginning, and then having proposals on how to solve or how to assure food supply, which is basically one of the biggest concerns nowadays. What about water? What about water shortages that we can face in the city? What else can they know about different countries they have? All of these pictures that you see relate to students that have been succeeding whenever they are performing a presentation. At the beginning, I won't lie to you, they felt completely lost. And I said, how are we going to get this? What are we learning from this? What's the point of it? But once they have pictured what the benefits of this were, I mean, like they really engaged because they started to feel that they practiced more, that they were reading, and then they didn't even feel it, but they were reading because they were curious about it. So then basically what we are triggering is also, we are triggering curiosity. We want them to research. We want them to use the language. So as I said at the beginning, what we are providing is an excuse. We are giving them an excuse to learn the language, to practice the language. As part of the UDL, that is a Universal Design for Learning, they are also entitled to create any kind of materials, from having some kind of models, as you can see in the picture, in which they were proposing to have some kind of sets of, they call it, well, like, let me explain how it was. It was basically fish underground, and they could plant, food on top of it. And of course, this would definitely guarantee food. So then that would guarantee that the population from a certain community would have access to edible food, coming from plants, but also having some sources of protein. On the other hand, they were looking at, for instance, a seed bunker. And they were talking about Syria, for instance. They needed to explore the context. They needed to explore what was happening there. However, of course, it was challenging for them to come to this conclusion. Definitely, there's no easy, process for students that are trying to build a solution. What we have to do is just provide students with the best possible scenarios we can. The very first thing that I would like to do just for this closing has to do directly, teachers, on how we can motivate our students. It's not about, I mean, like, well, of course, we all know that giving them some kind of games and stuff like that can actually be very positive. However, providing students with the correct motivation triggers, providing tools and projects that they can rely on, will definitely be positive for them. It is my pleasure to be with you today and share this very short and very little projects that I have been checking along these last months. It hasn't been an easy process, and learning the Universal Design for Learning is not that easy. However, it's very helpful and beneficial for our students. Thank you very much.